Hello, today is Wednesday, September 25th, and welcome to episode 364 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI Senior Fellow Lester Munson. I'm joined today by NSI Fellows Jessica Jones and Matt Hayden, and my fellow Senior Fellow, John Lipsey. Today we're going to talk about what is going on in southern Lebanon. There is a much hotter conflict between the state of Israel and Hezbollah forces in southern Lebanon. Israel, of course, a week ago, Israel blew up all of Hezbollah's pagers, walkie-talkies, and some solar panels for good measure. A notably innovative attack against a terrorist group that had been launching missiles into Israel on a daily basis for a year. Now the conflict has evolved to Israel bombing Hezbollah targets in southern Lebanon, hundreds of dead, thousands of injured. This conflict is escalating, if that's one of the things that you measure. So we're going to talk about that today. What do we think of it? President Biden was in New York at the UN General Assembly yesterday, gave a speech, basically urged both sides to show restraint and effectively stop fighting. Matt, I want to go to you first. Thanks for being on today. One way to look at this would be Iran invaded southern Lebanon 42 years ago and took territory through its proxy force Hezbollah, and Israel is decolonizing southern Lebanon. Is that the progressive view, in your opinion?
So I won't be able to address that because I haven't heard them reference that directly. So I'll smile when I pivot. But the challenge we see with a lot of what is happening in the region is that the United States as a whole at least isn't being obvious if they're leveraging a strategic outcome or a strategic playbook to address all these moves that we're seeing from the Iranians, whether that be the headlines across America about leveraging cyber hacks to hack and leak on presidential candidates, whether it's the advisories against the lives of presidential candidates, whether it's the ransomware actions around the world, and then you go to funding literal terrorism around the world to include Hezbollah and Hamas. And so when the U.S. steps back and looks at this playbook of options, they have sanctions, they have the diplomatic please don'ts. But at the end of the day, the outcome of does the U.S. see the action by Hezbollah and Hamas and the Iranians as something that's bad, so much so that we would engage with them at a much more stringent layer is not really obvious. We hear from the White House that they have concerns. What we don't see is if this escalates to this point further, or if this behavior continues, the United States is going to flex its muscle in this direction. And I think until we set that tone as the United States, you're going to have bad actors looking at this as opportunity space instead of a declared do not fly zone. And so there's going to be this potential escalation in conflict from anyone who wants to engage with Israel or is funded by Iran until this gets cleaned up.
Lipsey, Matt gives a very straight-ahead critique of U.S. policy as ineffective here, I would say. But if you thought the point of the Biden administration was to allow Israel to sequence the battles and first deal with Gaza and then deal with Lebanon, you would have to say this was strikingly successful, as the fighting in Gaza has essentially ended. And Israel now has carte blanche to do what it needs to do in southern Lebanon, arguably a very good thing for U.S. national interests. What say you, sir?
I think that is Israel. I think that's been Israel's strategy. They've been pretty explicit and clear about that. There was consideration at the start of just after October 7th of whether they would immediately sort of take on Hezbollah, and the decision was taken to sequence the war to the extent it was necessary to return people to their homes and secure their northern border. And we're now sort of at the culmination of that. The administration's theory of the case has been the Hezbollah issue was a symptom of Gaza, and you solve Gaza, and that means the Hezbollah challenge goes away, at least for the near term. There's obviously some logic to that. So then I think the root cause here is the White House has just had a misunderstanding of what was going to bring the Gaza war to an end. They've seen it as something that did not lend itself to a military solution, whereas Israel saw it exactly the opposite, that only a military solution was in the cards. And this, I think, the resistance to accept Israel's conviction on that point, that they were going to see the war to its end, I think delayed, bringing that conflict to a conclusion for a very long time, and has perpetuated the suffering in Gaza. And that's the reality that we are continuing to live with. And it's not the reality any of us would like to see, but we have to start designing our diplomacy and our foreign policy around the reality as it is, rather than what we wish it to be.
Jones, Lipsy talked about root causes there. I love looking into root causes. It would seem to me the root cause of the trouble in the Middle East is Iranian adventurism. Do you think the White House should appoint a senior official to be the czar in charge of dealing with the root causes of Middle East conflict?
I'm going to just like Matt sidestep your questions, Les. That's a very good point. I think to Lipsy's point, the Biden administration not having a clear understanding whether it's with our partners in Ukraine and Russia, and whether it's with Israel and the conflict that seems to be widening in the region, about what the end looks like and what the U.S.'s role can be in getting to the end of what our partners would like for resolution to look like. I do wonder, a lot of experts think that, or some experts were thinking that, thinking about sequencing of order and conflict, moving into Lebanon to really get to Israel's main foe, which is Iran, speaking of UNGA, we had both President Biden speaking there yesterday and also the new Iranian president speaking in New York, which is interesting as this conflict unfolds. But I wonder whether if the goal in southern Lebanon is to allow the 60,000 Israelis to return to northern Israel and to their homes, the returning evacuees, when we still have the returning of hostages that has still not been completed and is still, pulls at the heartstrings of folks who are missing family members, and how successful Israel can be while it, pivots to the north, is a question that I wonder about.
So I'm going to close this episode by saying that I think what we saw in New York yesterday was, in fact, the Biden doctrine, which is to go out in public and say a bunch of things that aren't really connected to reality and hope for things to happen that are not going to happen, and completely ignore the root causes of what is the real trouble. And I fear that the successor to President Biden, who will have an office in about 4 months, is just going to continue to do more of the same. And we're not going to see any kind of effective U.S. policy in the Middle East or anywhere else for that matter. Okay, that's a wrap. Thanks so much to Devlin Burney, Claude Jennings, and the NSI staff for their help in producing today's episode. Join us again on Friday, September 27th, for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. Fault Lines is on YouTube, so check out our channel for a video of today's episode. If you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.